The women looked as sad and as resigned as the men, their faces were agreeable but expressionless, and they wore gowns and petticoats of dark vadmel. As maidens, they wore over their braided hair a little knitted brown cap. When married, they put around their heads a colored handkerchief, crowned with a peak of white linen. After a good walk I returned to M. Fridrikson's house, where I found my uncle already in his host's company. Chapter 10. Interesting Conversations with Icelandic Savants. Dinner was ready. Professor Liedenbrock devoured his portion voraciously, for his compulsory fast on board had converted his stomach into a vast unfathomable gulf. There was nothing remarkable in the meal itself, but the hospitality of our host, more Danish than Icelandic, reminded me of the heroes of old. It was evident that we were more at home than he was himself. The conversation was carried on in the vernacular tongue, which my uncle mixed with German and M. Fridrikson with Latin for my benefit. It turned upon scientific questions as befits philosophers, but Professor Liedenbrock was excessively reserved, and at every sentence spoke to me with his eyes, enjoining the most absolute silence upon our plans. In the first place, M. Fridrikson wanted to know what success my uncle had had at the library. Your library? Why, there is nothing but a few tattered books upon almost deserted shelves. Indeed, replied M. Fridrikson, why, we possess 8,000 volumes, many of them valuable and scarce, works in the old Scandinavian language, and we have all the novelties that Copenhagen sends us every year. Where do you keep your 8,000 volumes? For my part, oh, M. Liedenbrock, they are all over the country. In this icy region we are fond of study. There is not a farmer nor a fisherman that cannot read and does not read. Our principle is, that books, instead of growing moldy behind an iron grating, should be worn out under the eyes of many readers. Therefore, these volumes are passed from one to another, read over and over, referred to again and again, and it often happens that they find their way back to their shelves only after an absence of a year or two. And in the meantime, said my uncle rather spitefully, strangers. Well, what would you have? Foreigners have their libraries at home, and the first essential for laboring people is that they should be educated. I repeat to you the love of reading runs in Icelandic blood. In 1816 we founded a prosperous literary society. Learned strangers think themselves honored in becoming members of it. It publishes books which educate our fellow countrymen, and do the country great service. If you will consent to be a corresponding member, Herr Liedenbrock, you will be giving us great pleasure. My uncle, who had already joined about 100 learned societies, accepted with a grace which evidently touched M. Fridriksson. Now, said he, will you be kind enough to tell me what books you hope to find in our library, and I may perhaps enable you to consult them? My uncle's eyes and mine met. He hesitated. This direct question went to the root of the matter. But after a moment's reflection he decided on speaking. Monsieur Fridriksson, I wish to know if amongst your ancient books you possessed any of the works of Arne Saknussemm? Arne Saknussemm, replied the Reykjavik professor. You mean that learned 16th century savant, a naturalist, a chemist, and a traveler? Just so. One of the glories of Icelandic literature and science? That's the man. An illustrious man anywhere. Quite so. And whose courage was equal to his genius. I see that you know him well. My uncle was bathed in delight at hearing his hero thus described. He feasted his eyes upon M. Fridriksson's face. Well, he cried, where are his works? His works, we have them not. What, not in Iceland? They are neither in Iceland nor anywhere else. Why is that? Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burned by the hands of the common hangman. Very good. Excellent. Cried my uncle, to the great scandal of the professor of natural history. What? He cried. Yes, yes, now it is all clear, now it is all unraveled, and I see why Saknussemm, put into the Index Expurgatorius, and compelled to hide the discoveries made by his genius, was obliged to bury in an incomprehensible cryptogram the secret. What secret? Asked M. Fridriksson, starting. Oh, just a secret which, my uncle stammered. Have you some private document in your possession? Asked our host. No, I was only supposing a case. Oh, very well, answered M. Fridriksson, who was kind enough not to pursue the subject when he had noticed the embarrassment of his friend. I hope you will not leave our island until you have seen some of its mineralogical wealth. Certainly, replied my uncle, but I am rather late, or have not others been here before me? Yes, Herr Liedenbrock, the labors of M.M. Olofsson and Pavelsen, pursued by order of the king, the researches of Troil, the scientific mission of M.M. Gaimard and Robert on the French corvette La Recherche, and lately the observations of scientific men who came in the Rain Hortense, have added materially to our knowledge of Iceland. But I assure you there is plenty left. Do you think so? Said my uncle, pretending to look very modest, and trying to hide the curiosity was flashing out of his eyes. Oh, yes, how many mountains, glaciers, and volcanoes there are to study, which are as yet but imperfectly known.